Hi there, I'm the Macabre, and I'm here to assist you today. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel before you watch it, since I know you use it to fall asleep. What time are you viewing right now, and where are you from? Sit back and unwind. The cabin was supposed to be my haven, a place where I could finally finish my novel, but instead it became my prison. I remember the day I arrived, my old Subaru creaking over the gravel road. The cabin was a cozy wooden structure nestled between towering pines, and as I carried my suitcase and boxes of research material inside, I felt as though the stress of city life was fading away. I couldn't help but smile. The interior was rustic but cozy, with a stone fireplace dominating one of the walls, flanked by built-in bookshelves in a corner, a small kitchen, a narrow staircase leading to what I thought was the ideal bedroom, and murmurs. On the fourth day, I noticed something odd, so I spent the morning editing and perfecting my work. I went to the kitchen for a drink of water once I got back, feeling refreshed and flushed. I froze when I reached for it. The pile of papers on the counter, which had my notes from the night before, had been shifted. I scowled as I tried to recall if I had touched them before I went. I had doubts about leaving them. In a neat stack next to my laptop, they were now scattered as if someone had been reading it. A chill ran down my spine, but I shook it immediately. I must have moved them around without realizing it, or maybe there was a draft of air that I hadn't jotted down. I gathered the papers by tapping them gently to stack them again, and tried to push the incident out of my mind, however. In the following days, the strange occurrences piled up. A chair in the living room was slightly out of place. My favorite mug appeared in a different closet than the one that had left it. Little things that were easy to discard but that ate away at me, making me more and more uncomfortable in what should have been my private refuge. I began to double-check the locks before lying down to look out the windows into the darkness, struggling to see if anyone was there, but the forest stood still and silent. Revealing nothing on the seventh night, I woke up startled, my heart pounding. A noise roused me from sleep, a blow from the floor below. I remained frozen in bed, pricking up my ears. There was again the unmistakable sound of footsteps. My breath stuck in my throat as I moved as silently as possible, slipped, groped in the darkness in search of something. Anything I could use as a weapon. My fingers closed around a heavy lantern would have to do. I carefully made my way down the stairs, shivering with each creak of the old wood. The ground floor was dark and peaceful, just as I had imagined, and I was about to turn around when a floorboard creaked behind me. I swung the lantern high like a club, its ace of light cutting the darkness, but there was nothing there, just shadows and silence. "Hello," I knocked in a trembling voice. "There's someone there," but there was no answer, just the rumble of my own heart in my ears. I searched every room and closet, but there was no sign of an intruder. The doors were still locked, the windows were secure, and when the adrenaline subsided, I felt like a total fool. I must have been calming the house or the wind. I was letting my imagination run wild, but when I got back into bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next morning, I woke up with sunlight filtering through the windows in the daylight. My fears seemed ridiculous. I threw myself into my writing, determined to make up for lost time. It was late in the afternoon when I finally emerged from my work. Stretching my numb muscles, I decided to go for a walk, clear my head for the evening writing session. The forest was beautiful, with the dappled light filtering through the canopy. The birds were calling to each other overhead, and a gentle breeze was stirring the leaves. I felt my spirit lift with every step. I was so lost in my thoughts that I almost, and I didn't notice it, a flash of movement among the trees. Between I closed my eyes, trying to see what a servant was, perhaps, but then I saw him again, and my blood froze. He wasn't an animal. He was a person sliding through the trees, keeping my pace, the heart beating against my ribs. The figure matched my speed. I broke the branches in a race, scratching my face as I rushed through the undergrowth. I didn't stop until I reached the cabin. Closing the door behind me and bolting, I stood there panting, straining to hear any sound of chase, but there was nothing. All I could picture were my own panting breath and the typical woodland noises. I was going crazy. I spent the rest of the afternoon curled up on the couch, envelopes with every noise I tried to write, but the words didn't come. Every creak of the cabin, every whisper out of the windows. I made my heart soaring again when night fell. I checked each lock 3 times before retiring to the bedroom. Sleep was elusive, but finally exhaustion overcame me. I don't know how long I slept before the sound woke me up. My eyes snapped open, my body tense. There it was again, the slow and deliberate turn of the doorknob. I held my breath, praying that I was dreaming, but the soft click of the latch, freeing himself, he told me that this was terribly real. The door opened wide, a silhouette filled the threshold, silhouetted against the dim moonlight that entered through the window of the corridor. I could make out broad shoulders, the figure of a man, but no detail of the face. I wanted to scream, run, but the terror left me paralyzed. I watched helplessly as the figure took a step into the room. "Who are you?" I managed to ask in a broken voice. "What do you want?" The figure stopped, then spoke. His voice was low, harsh, and gave me a chill in my spine. "I want what is mine." Confusion mixed with fear. "What are you talking about?" "I have nothing of yours." A dry and humorless laugh echoed in the darkness. "Oh, but you have it. This cabin, these forests are mine, and you are invading my mind." I worked at full speed. "That's impossible. Balboa rent this cabin legally. I have the documents, papers," spat out the word with senseless contempt. "This land has belonged to my family for generations. No piece of paper changes." That advanced another step. I hit the headboard of the bed, desperately looking for a way out, but he blocked the only door, and the windows were too small to escape. "Please," I said, hating the shaking in my voice. "Didn't know. I'll leave in the morning, I promise." Another laugh, this time darker. "Oh, it's too late for that. You've seen too much. You've heard too much." "I haven't seen anything," I begged. "I don't know who you are. I can't identify you." He interrupted me with a growl. "But you've been in my home, you've touched my things, you've left you everywhere." Another step. "I'm not afraid. I can't let you out." Terror clung to my throat. This couldn't be happening at any moment. I would wake up and realize that it was just a nightmare brought on by too much coffee and nights of writing. But the cold steel that pressed against my seat made it clear to me. "Get up," ordered, his voice trembling. I obeyed. He grabbed my arm with a force that made me gasp in pain and dragged me down the stairs. Mind was frantically working, looking for a way to escape. When we got to the front door, an idea occurred to me. I let my knees buckle and fell to the floor with a gasp. My ankle gasped. I think I twisted it. He cursed, loosening his grip for an instant. It was all I needed. With all my might, I turned and dug my elbow into the solar plexus. He let out a grunt of pain. Bending over, I slammed open the door and threw myself into the darkness of the forest, the branches hitting my face as I ran to reap the fear fueling my adrenaline. Behind me, I heard his voice roaring of fury, followed by the sound of branches breaking. When he came out in pursuit, I ran until my lungs burned, until my legs looked like jelly. Sounds of his chase became more subdued. I dared to look back and saw no sign of him. Yet I didn't slow down. I kept running until I saw lights in the distance, a road. My salvation. I stumbled to the side of the road just as a car was approaching. I raised my arms, frantically begging for it to stop. The vehicle slowed down and stopped a few feet away from me. A woman, older man with a kind face, rolled down the window. "It's okay, miss." I shook my head, tears of relief running down my face. I couldn't say between gasps, "Please, I need help." He opened the passenger door for me. "Go upstairs. Let's go straight to the police station." As we walked away, chilling certainty this wasn't over. He would find me again. The cabin was supposed to be my sanctuary. Instead, it was the beginning of a nightmare, of the one that might never arouse. Laughter died in my throat when I saw the figure standing at the edge of the forest. At that moment, I knew that our weekend getaway was about to turn into a fight for survival. Everything had started innocently. My 3 best friends and I had planned this trip for months. We wanted to escape the chaos of our daily lives and reconnect in the peaceful solitude of nature. We had found the perfect place, a secluded cabin deep in the forest, far from the nearest village and without cell phone signal. I was relieved when we got there on Friday afternoon. The cabin was rustic but charming, with a large porch and large windows that promised plenty of natural light. A stone fireplace suggested cozy nights by the fire, and we unloaded the car between jokes and laughter, carrying our backpacks and provisions inside. The cabin was even cozier, with lots of warm wood and comfortable furniture. The air was fresh and clean from my shoulders, impregnated with the scent of pine needles and damp earth, and a gentle breeze stirred the leaves in the distance. Sarah exclaimed, "This is perfect," as she jumped out of the car and spread her arms wide. That first night was everything we had hoped for. We grilled burgers on the grill from the backyard. We shared stories and caught up as the sun set in a burst of oranges and roses. After dinner we huddled around the fireplace, opening a bottle of wine and playing cards late into the night. It was until the next day that things started to feel weird. We spent the morning hiking, exploring the trails that wind through the forest. The nature was stunning, with sunlight filtering through the treetops and tinting the ground with dancing shadows. But as we made our way into the trees, an uncomfortable feeling began to take hold of me. It was as if we were being watched. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, expecting to see something in the undergrowth. But there was never anything, just trees and bushes. "You're fine?" Mike asked me. Noticing my uneasiness, I forced a smile. "Yes, I just thought I heard something, probably an animal." But the feeling lingered even after. Returning to the cabin, as the afternoon progressed and the sun began to set, I found myself constantly looking out the windows, looking for something. I didn't know what. I just knew something was wrong that night. We sat around the campfire, roasting marshmallows and telling scary stories. I closed my eyes and tried to make out what it was, and I said in a barely audible whisper, "I think there's something out there." For a long moment, the others remained silent as we watched the darkness, straining to see or hear something unusual, but I didn't see anything. Eventually, Tom said, "You're getting carried away by scary stories, but I dream of." We huddled closer to the fire, our eyes darting nervously from shadow to shadow, and Sarah was the next to spot him. "Oh my God," she whispered, grabbing my arm, and we turned, and I felt my blood run cold. A figure was standing on the edge of the forest, just out of range of the campfire light. It was difficult to make out details, but it was unmistakably human. Before anyone could respond, Mike whispered, "Who are they?" Two more figures appeared from the trees and stood on the sides of the first. They weren't lost or confused. Instead, they were observing us. Then, as the light from the campfire illuminated their faces, they started to move toward us. Reality hit us hard with one fist, and we realized that there were no faces. All of them were wearing white masks with blank features. "Run!" Tom yelled, breaking the spell that had us paralyzed. We leaped to our feet, leaving everything behind, and ran towards the cabin. I could hear their heavy footsteps behind us, getting closer and closer until we arrived at the door, slamming it shut and bolting it. Mike and Tom pushed a heavy bookshelf against us, the entrance assuring them Sarah with her face pale with fear. There was no time to respond. A loud knock shook the door. Another. They were trying to enter. "We need to call the police," I said, taking out my phone. With no signal, I cursed quietly. We were alone. The knocks on the door became louder, more insistent. The sound of the wood astle told us he wouldn't last long. "They are going to come in," whispered Mike. "We need something to defend ourselves." We scattered, looking for anything that could serve as a weapon. I ran to the kitchen and opened the drawers desperately until I found a large knife. It seemed pathetically inadequate against what awaited us. A rumble in the living room made me swirl. The door had given way. Heavy steps, furniture falling. I crushed myself against the kitchen wall, the knife trembling in my hand. Shadows crossed the door. I held my breath. Sarah screamed somewhere in the cabin. The masked man who was in the kitchen turned his head in that direction. It was now or never. With a cry of terror and determination, I lunged at him, plunging the knife into his back, but it was faster than I expected. He spun around, catching my wrist with brutal force. The knife fell to the ground with a dry sound. His other hand covered my mouth to drown out my scream, dragged me into the living room, where I saw that the others had also been captured. They knelt on the floor and tied our hands behind our backs with plastic zip ties. One of the men, taller than the others, approached. His voice, muffled by the mask, was cold and threatening. "Where is he?" We looked at each other, confused. "Where is he? What was he?" asked Tom. The man hit him with the back of their gun. "Don't play with me. We know you have." "It's Sarah, Solos. We don't know. What are they talking about?" The man bowed his head as if evaluating us. "Then we will have to look," and with that they began to destroy the cabin. For the next hour we watched helplessly as the masked men destroyed the cabin, threw the cushions from the sofa, ripped the drawers from the furniture, and overturned the dining room table. The books were torn from the shelves and thrown to the floor. One of them kicked the chimney in frustration when he found nothing. The tension in the room grew with every passing minute. The men couldn't find what they were looking for, and their patience was running out. The leader of La Pandilla, the taller man with the raspy voice, approached us again. "Last chance," said in a low and dangerous tone. "Where is he?" "We don't know what you're talking about," I screamed, despair seeping into my voice. "We're here on vacation. We have nothing." His jaw tightened under the mask. He slowly turned his head and pointed at Mike with a chin. Flick, one of the masked men walked over, pulled a knife out of his pocket, and pressed it against Mike's cheek. "Sarah, Solos, please," begged. "Really, we don't know anything." The leader sighed with exasperation and rubbed his temples with a gloved hand. "Very well," muttered. "If they don't tell us where he is, then we'll have to start making them talk." The threat implicit in his words made my blood run cold. The man holding Mike smiled under his mask and pressed the blade of the knife a little more. Against his skin I saw a thin line of blood appear on his cheek. Mike closed eyes tight. "It's all right, Tom." Suddenly, "Wait." We all turned to him in surprise. Tom whispered, not knowing if he was about to betray or just trying to buy time. He swallowed hard and looked at the leader of the masked ones. "We rent this cabin," he said. "We don't know anything about what they were looking for, but maybe the owners." "Yes." The leader was silent for a moment, finally leaned a little towards Tom. "And where are those owners now?" Tom swallowed saliva. "I don't know. We dealt with an online rental agency." The man clicked his tongue and stood up again. "Then they are useless." He turned to his men and nodded at them. In an instant I felt rough hands grab my arm and get up. Suddenly Sarah screamed when another man pulled her unceremoniously, and Mike squirmed uselessly in his grip. They were dragging us out of the cabin. The cold night air hit us as we came out. The moonlight illuminated the clearing where we had parked our car. It was then, when I saw him, a slight movement just beyond the circle of firelight between. I closed my eyes trying to make out what it was. "Boys," I said in a barely audible whisper, "I think there's something out there." The others, they were silent, following my gaze for a long moment. We all watched the darkness, straining to see or hear something unusual. "I don't see anything," Tom finally said. "You're getting carried away by scary stories." But his tone of voice had a tinge of tension that told me he wasn't as sure as he tried to pretend. We huddled a little closer to the fire, our eyes jumping nervously from shadow to shadow. Sarah was the next time see him. "Oh my God," he whispered, grabbing my arm. "Look." We turned and I felt the blood run out of me. A figure was standing on the edge of the forest, just out of reach of the campfire light. It was hard to make out details, but it was unmistakably human. "Who they are," Mike whispered before anyone could answer. Two more figures emerged from the trees and stood on the sides of the first one. A shivers ran down my spine. They weren't lost. They weren't disoriented. They were watching us. Then they began to move with deliberate steps. They advanced towards us. When the light of the campfire illuminated their faces, reality hit with the force of a fist. There were no faces. Each of them was wearing one more white masks, without empty features. "Run!" Tom screamed, breaking the spell that kept us paralyzed. We jumped to our feet, leaving everything back and running to the cabin. I could hear his heavy footsteps behind of us getting closer and closer. We got to the door, slammed it shut and bolted it. Mike and Tom pushed a heavy shelf against the entrance as best they could. "What the hell is going on?" alone. Sarah with a face pale with fear. There was no time to respond. A loud knock shook the door. Another was trying to get in. "We need to call the police," I said, pulling out my phone with no signal. I cursed in a loud voice. Downstairs, we were alone. The knocks on the door got louder, more insistent, the sound of the wood roasting. "He told us it wouldn't last long. They're going to come in," whispered Mike. "We need something to defend ourselves." We scattered, looking for anything that could serve as a weapon. I ran to the kitchen and opened the drawers desperately until I found a large knife. It seemed pathetically inadequate against what awaited us. A rumble in the living room. He swung me around the door. He had given way. Heavy footsteps, furniture falling. He crushed me against the kitchen wall, the knife trembling in my hand. Shadows crossed the door. I held my breath. Sarah screamed somewhere in the cabin. The masked man who was in the kitchen turned his head in that direction. It was now or never. With a cry of terror and determination, I rushed towards him, plunging the knife to his back, but it was faster than I expected. He spun around, catching my wrist with brutal force. The knife fell to the ground with a sharp sound. His other hand covered my mouth to drown out my scream, dragged me into the living room where I saw that the others had also been captured. They knelt on the ground and tied our hands behind our backs with plastic zip ties. One of the men, louder than the others, he approached. His voice, muffled by the mask, was cold and threatening. "Where is he?" We look at each other, confused. "Where is he?" "What did Tom ask?" The man hit him with the back of his gun. "Don't play with me. We know you have it." "Sarah Los, we don't know. What are you talking about?" The man bowed his head as if evaluating us. "Then we will have to look," and with that they began to destroy the cabin for the next hour. We watched helplessly as the masked men vandalized the cabin, threw the cushions off the sofa, ripped the drawers off the furniture, and overturned the dining room table. The books were ripped from the shelves and thrown to the floor. One of them kicked the chimney in frustration when he found nothing. The tension in the room grew with each passing minute. The men could not find what they were looking for, and their patience was running out. The leader of the gang, the tallest man with the raspy voice, approached us again. Last chance, he said in a low and dangerous tone. Where he is? We don't know what you're talking about. I screamed, despair seeping into my voice. We're here on vacation. We have nothing. His jaw tensed under the mask. He slowly turned his head and pointed at Mike with a chin flick. One of the masked men came over, took a knife out of his pocket and pressed it against Mike's cheek. Sarah Soul, Lowe's, please, begged. For real, we don't know anything. The leader sighed in exasperation and rubbed his temples with a gloved hand. Very well, muttered, if they don't tell us where he is, then we'll have to start making them talk. My blood ran cold at the implied menace in his words. The man holding Mike smiled under the mask and pressed the blade of the knife a little more against his skin. I saw a thin line of blood appear on his cheek. Mike closed his eyes tightly. It's okay, Jade. Tom. Suddenly, wait. We all turned to him in surprise. Tom, I whispered, not knowing if he was about to betray us or just trying to buy time. He swallowed hard and looked at the leader of the masked men. We rent this cabin, he said. We don't know anything about what they were looking for, but maybe the owners. Yes. The leader was silent for a moment, finally leaned a little towards Tom. And where are those owners now? Tom swallowed. I don't know. We just dealt with an online rental agency. The man clicked his tongue and stood up again. Then they are useless. He turned to his men and he nodded at them. In an instant I felt rough hands grab my arm and get up suddenly. Sarah screamed when another man pulled her unceremoniously and Mike squirmed uselessly in his grip. They were dragging us out of the cabin. The cold night air hit us as we came out. The moonlight illuminated the clearing where we had parked our car. It was then when I saw him. One of the men were holding a can of gasoline. Panic hit me like a slap. I didn't scream, fighting my captor. Wait, the leader in slowly turned to me. Why, he said with false curiosity, you said you didn't know nothing. If it's true, then we don't need to keep you alive. I saw how the man with the can of gas started spraying it on the cabin. A second masked man took a box of matches from his pocket. You don't have to do this, Jade, just go away. We can forget this. Past his head as if he considered my plea, then shook his head. We can't take that risk. He turned and pulled a gun from his belt. My legs turned jelly. They were going to kill us here in the middle of nowhere with no witnesses, no chance of help. They wouldn't find our bodies until someone else rented the cabin. If it is, there was something left after the fire. The man with the ill-lit one and held it between his fingers. He was about to throw it when suddenly a sound cut through the air. Sirens, first far away, then louder, approaching at full speed. Masked men froze, muttered one of them. Red and blue lights appeared on the gravel road, reflecting off the tree trunks. Two police patrols stopped at full speed in front of the cabin. The masked men looked at each other. Yes, let's go, the leader ordered. They let Sarah and me go all at once and ran into the woods, disappearing into the trees just as the officers were getting out of their cars with their guns drawn. Shouted one of the officers, hands up, but the attackers had already disappeared into the darkness. I collapsed, unable to stand. Tears of relief ran down my face as Sarah slumped beside me, shaking. Mike and Tom could barely breathe. The officers rushed over and surrounded us, asking if we were injured in Bland. We tried to explain what had happened. Later, we learned the truth. The former tenants of the cabin had been involved in a smuggling ring. They had hidden a fortune in stolen diamonds somewhere on the property. Before they were arrested, the masked men were their former associates, convinced that we had come to get their loot back, but never found the diamonds. Maybe they were never there. Maybe they're still hiding, waiting for someone to discover them. We won't know, because none of us ever returned to that forest. What had started as a relaxing getaway ended as a nightmare to this day. Sometimes I wake up in the dark, sweating cold. Sometimes in the corners of my mind, I see those figures standing among the trees, their blank white masks, staring at me, waiting. And I know that although we managed to escape that night, something of us stayed in that cabin and something of them still haunts us. The moment I saw the branch deliberately broken, I knew I wasn't alone. What I didn't know was that my peaceful camping trip was about to become a scary cat-and-mouse game. I had been looking forward to this solo trip to the Rocky Mountains of Colorado for months. As a software developer in Denver, my days were filled with endless lines of code, fluorescent lights and the constant buzz of notifications, I craved the solitude and silence of the forest. A respite to disconnect and recharge. The first day was everything I had hoped for. I found the perfect place for my truck, a small clearing surrounded by towering pines with a bubbling stream nearby. The air was fresh and pure, permeated with the scent of pine needles and sylvester sage. As I set up my camp, I felt the tension in my shoulders fade away that night. I sat by the campfire, watching the flames dance as the stars began to shine in the sky. The only sounds were the rustling of firewood and the whisper of the wind through the trees. I took a deep breath, feeling more relaxed than in months. I slept soundly, lulled by the silence of the forest. The next day I woke up early, eager to explore my surroundings. After a quick breakfast, I set off on a little-traveled trail that wound up the mountain. The views were breathtaking from the highest points. I could see miles of uninterrupted forest, only occasionally interrupted by the silver reflection of a distant lake or towering mountaintop. I took my time, stopping often to take photos or just to absorb the majesty of the scenery. It was on my way back when I noticed something strange. A broken branch pierced across the trail was fresh, the wood still pale where it had split. I was sure I hadn't been there when I passed by for the first time. A chill ran down my spine. Suddenly, I realized how abnormally quiet the forest was. There were no bird songs, there were no whispers of little animals in the undergrowth, just silence. I quickened El Paso, feeling an uncomfortable nape on the back of my neck. When I finally returned to my camp, I tried to shake off the feeling of uneasiness. I was probably getting carried away by paranoia. I was in the middle of the forest. An animal could have broken the branch. There was nothing to worry about. But that night, when the sun sank behind the trees, anxiety, it came back. Every rustle of the leaves. It seemed louder than usual for the first time since I arrived. Sorry to be completely alone. I built my campfire bigger than necessary, seeking comfort in its light and warmth still. Every time I looked out into the darkness of the forest, I had the strange feeling that someone was watching me. That night I slept restlessly, waking up with every little sound. When the dawn finally broke the gloom, I was relieved. But when I opened the door of my truck and walked out, my relief vanished in an instant. There in the soft earth around my camp there were footprints, and they weren't mine. My hands began to tremble as I examined. The marks were large, much larger than those on my boots, and the print on the sole pattern was unfamiliar. Someone had been prowling around my camp while I slept. My first instinct was to pack up my things and leave immediately. But another part of me, a stubborn part that had faced countless impossible deadlines and systems crises, refused to let itself be overcome by fear. I decided to stay. But with more caution I went for a walk again, but this time I left obvious signs of the direction I was going. Then quietly I backed off down a different path, observing if I had been able to do so. When I returned to camp, I discovered something that made my blood run cold. A small mound of rocks had been purposefully left in the middle of my sight. There was no way that it was natural. Someone had left it there with a message. I wasn't sure what it meant, but I knew that I wasn't alone that night. I didn't light a fire. I locked myself in my truck, I covered myself, and I looked through a small opening in the curtain. The hours went by slowly, and just as I was about to give up to sleep, I noticed a slight movement on the edge of my field of vision. I held my breath and looked at it. At first, I saw nothing. Then, a figure emerged from the tree shadows, moving slowly and deliberately toward me. My heart is pounding so hard I feared I could hear him. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man dressed in dark clothes that made him almost invisible at night. He was moving cautiously around my vehicle, stopping at every window as if trying to look inside. I held my breath, paralyzed. What did I want? Was he just curious or had much more sinister intentions? After what seemed like an eternity, the man slowly walked away and I went into the darkness of the forest. I didn't sleep for a minute. When the light of dawn began to tint the sky, I made a decision. I was leaving. But when I tried to start my truck, the engine didn't start. A cold sweat ran down my back. I tried again. Nothing. My battery was dead. At some point in the night someone had sabotaged it. Panic took hold of me. I was trapped. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to think with clarity. Had a portable jump starter stored in the back compartment of the truck. But to reach it I had to get out. I looked out the windows. The forest seemed quiet. Gathering all my courage, I opened the door cautiously and slid it just as my fingers closed around the starter. A rustling of branches made me spin suddenly, and there he was, standing at the edge of the clearing. I saw his face for the first time. It was bigger than I had imagined. Gray hair, skin tanned by the elements. His clothes were worn and dirty, as if he had been living in the woods for a long time. We stared at each other in silence. Then he spoke. His voice was hoarse and raspy. "You shouldn't be here. You shouldn't be here." His voice was deep, worn by time and disuse. My throat was dry. "I didn't know," I said with my heart beating in my ears. "I didn't want to invade. I just came to camp." The man tilted his head, studying himself around the jump starter. "All I had to do was plug it into the battery, and maybe, just maybe, I could get out of here." But the man wasn't moving. He was still standing, watching me. He seemed to be deciding something. "I'm going to leave," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I don't want any problems. Just let me start my truck and know you'll see me again." The man didn't respond immediately. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he pointed his finger at my truck. "You already tried to leave," he said in a deep voice. "It didn't work, right?" Panic enveloped me. I knew what he was implying. I knew he had done something. "You went, you asked?" I asked quietly. "Sabotage. My battery." It didn't answer. I didn't need to. The truth was in his eyes, in the way he looked at me, testing my reactions, enjoying the growing fear inside me. I gritted my teeth. I wasn't going to let him see me tremble. I took a deep breath, and with slow, calculated movements, I opened the engine compartment of the truck. The man made no movement to stop me. But he didn't leave either. He stared at me as I connected the jump starter to the battery, pressed the start button, and waited. The engine made a clicking noise, but it didn't start. I tried again. Nothing. My truck wasn't going to start. My hands started shaking. I couldn't go in pee. I had to think. If the battery wasn't the problem, then I had done something else. Maybe I had cut some wire. Maybe I had emptied the fuel, and without my truck I was trapped. The man let out a snort, as if reading my thoughts. "You should have left earlier." I took a step back. Walking away from the truck, he remained motionless, but I felt that muscle in his body was tense, ready for what? To attack me. To see how long it would take me to lose my sanity. I swallowed hard. "Look, I don't want any problems if you let me go. I promise I'll never say anything." The man tilted his head curiously, then smiled. No, a friendly smile, not a reassuring smile. It was a crooked, malicious smile. "I don't care what you say," no one whispered. "He'll come to get you." My heart stopped for a second. Then I understood. He wasn't going to let me go. The realization hit me like a bucket of ice water. I had to get out of here now, but I couldn't just run. I was in his territory. He knew the forest better than I did. If I went into the trees without a plan, without provisions, I wouldn't get far. But if I stayed, I knew how it would end. My mind worked at full speed. I had to distract him. I took a deep breath and feigned resignation. "It's okay," I said. "I understand. I shouldn't have come here." His eyes closed. I knew he didn't believe me, but he hesitated, and that was my chance. I moved my head to the side, pretending there was something behind him. "What is that?" I blurted out in surprise. It was a stupid trick, cliché, but it worked. The man turned his head just a second, and I ran. I ran like my life depended on it, because I did. I heard his growl of anger when he realized my deception. I heard his footsteps crushing the brush as he lunged after me, but I had the upper hand. He didn't expect me to move so fast. I dove through the trees, dodging branches, jumping over roots, my lungs burning. My legs screamed from the effort, but I didn't stop. The forest, it was dense, dark, even in broad daylight. If I managed to find a hiding place, if I could lose it for a few minutes, maybe I'd have a chance. A fallen tree with a trunk strong enough to conceal me was then visible, and I hurled myself behind it, collapsing to the ground and choking on my own breath. A few seconds later, the guy rushed into the clearing, halted his labored breathing, and shook his head. "No, you can run forever," I hum in the darkness of the forest. I stood perfectly still. I could feel him searching for me, and every second that went by without him finding me was a tiny victory. But I couldn't stay here. I had to keep going. When his footsteps started to move away, I seized the opportunity and slid myself in the direction. I remembered seeing a road the first time I arrived. If I made it there, maybe there would be a car. Maybe I could stop someone. The sound of branches breaking in the distance told me that he was still searching for me, but he had no advantage anymore. I was the hunter, and he had no idea how far I was willing to go in order to survive. The forest felt denser as I entered it, the shadows lengthened by the dim light. Dawn. I had no idea how long I had been running, but every muscle in my body protested. Then I heard a low, guttural laugh that made my blood turn to ice. I wasn't running from a simple territorial bum name. His voice echoed through the trees, and I was enjoying it. I couldn't let the fear paralyze me, so I gritted my teeth and forced myself to move on. I couldn't let the fear paralyze me. I had to be close. I had to be. My mind calculated every possible option, so if I reached the road and found a car, I had a chance. If not, I had to duck immediately. He was too close. I peered through the bushes and saw him walking slowly, looking around calmly, as if he knew that I would eventually find myself. I couldn't continue like this. I had to do something. It was then that I noticed the large rotting trunk a few meters away. Carefully I tore a thick branch from the ground and threw it in that direction. The sound of the wood breaking rumbled through the forest. The man immediately turned and ran towards the noise. My chance. I seized the moment and shot in the opposite direction. Driven by pure adrenaline, I ran without looking back until I finally saw her on the road, a thin and cracked asphalt road winding through the forest. My chest shook with a sob of relief, but I still wasn't safe if he saw me, if he left the forest and caught up with me before a car passed. My mind was screaming contradictory orders: wait, run, hide, but my body had already decided. I ran to the edge of the road and raised my arms, begging for a car to show up. Please, please, and then the lights. An old truck turned the curve. I threw myself into the middle of the road, waving my arms frantically. The driver slammed on the brakes, the screech of the tires piercing the silence of the forest. The door of the truck slammed open and an older man rushed out. Holy God, boy, you're all right? My breathing was erratic. Help! I managed to scream. Someone's chasing me. The driver frowned, looking out into the woods. The silence was total. There was no trace of the man, but I knew he was there, hidden in the shadows, watching. The driver looked at my dirty clothes, my scratches, my desperate expression, nodded firmly, and opened the passenger door. He climbed in. I didn't hesitate for a second. I threw myself into the truck and closed the door tightly. The man stepped on the accelerator, and when I looked in the rearview mirror, there I was standing at the edge of the forest, motionless, watching me leave. And even though the distance between us grew, something inside me told me that this wasn't over. He wasn't done with me. I never went back to that forest. I never went back to that forest again. I made a camping trip alone. Sometimes when I drive on lonely roads, I feel the urge to look in the rearview mirror. I fear what I might see. I fear someday, somewhere, I'll find him again, or worse still, he will find me. From the moment I heard the first whisper, I knew I should never have come here. I had been looking for a quiet place to write my novel. The city was too noisy, and every time I tried to concentrate, something would interrupt me. Neighbors, traffic, notifications. So I rented a small cabin in the middle of the Oregon forest, far from everything, no signal, no internet, just me and my story. I arrived one cold afternoon with the sun sinking behind the trees. The cabin was simple but cozy, with a fireplace, an aged wooden table, and a bay window overlooking a quiet lake. It was perfect. The first days were productive. I wrote for hours, immersing myself in my fictional world. I walked along the nearby trails, breathing the fresh air of the forest. At night I read by the fire, enjoying the absolute silence. But the third night I woke up from there was a whisper in the cabin. I opened it with my heart beating in my throat. I listened carefully. Nothing. Maybe it had just been the wind through the trees. I forced myself to relax and closed my eyes again. But then the whisper became clearer. They were not distinguishable words, just a low, slurred murmur, as if someone was talking just on the other side of the wall. I sat up on the bed. Hello. My own voice sounded weak in the darkness. Silence. I mustered up the courage, grabbed the flashlight, and left the room. The living room was empty. The fireplace had gone out, leaving the cabin in darkness. Nothing moved. I checked. The front door was still locked. The same with the windows. I was alone. I tried to convince myself that it was my imagination, and I went back to bed. But I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning I decided to let it go. Maybe the isolation was affecting me. I spent the day writing, trying to distract myself, until I found the note. It was on the kitchen table, a piece of yellowed paper folded carefully. I didn't remember leaving it there. With my heart racing, I opened it. It only had 3 words written in trembling handwriting: "You're not alone." My blood froze. I dropped the note like if I got burned. Someone had been here. My first reaction was to check the whole cabin. I looked for traces, signs that someone else had entered. Nothing. The door was still closed. the windows intact, but then I noticed something. The attic trapdoor was ajar. Fear turned to pure panic. I grabbed the poker from the fireplace as a weapon and slowly approached, pulled the trapdoor, and a staircase creaked as darkness unfolded. I turned on the flashlight and I pointed inside and saw the marks on the dusty floor, footprints. Someone had been living up there. My breathing became erratic. I looked around, but the attic was empty. Just a dirty mat, a couple of empty water bottles, and a pile of crumpled notes. I took them with trembling hands. They were all the same. You're not alone. You see me, but you don't see me. I'm here. A sound behind me. I turned around. I hit the flashlight, shaking in my hand. Nothing, but the air felt different. I got out of the attic as fast as I could and yanked the trapdoor shut. No matter who or what had been there, I wasn't going to stick around to find out. Grabbed my things in minutes without bothering to pack properly. When I got out of the cabin, the feeling of being watched was suffocating. I got in the car and stepped on the gas without looking. I drove back without stopping until I reached the nearest town. I went straight to the office of the owner of the cabin and told him everything. I expected him to laugh, that he was crazy, but his expression became somber. "You are not the first," he said in a low voice that he sighed, running a hand over his face. "That cabin we have rented many times, and people always leave before finishing their stay. Some say they hear things, others find notes. Who leaves them?" The owner looked at me wearily. "We never found anyone." A chill ran down my spine. I didn't want to keep asking. I left that same night. I never finished my novel. I never went back to seek tranquility in the forest, because I know the truth. Sometimes when you think you're alone, you're not. I never thought that the Duta Desert would be the place where I would face my own mortality, but while as I looked at the barrel of a gun pointed directly at my face, I understood that sometimes loneliness comes at a deadly price. The journey began as a necessary escape from my hectic life in San Francisco as a high-level executive. My days were a whirlwind of endless meetings, phone calls, and an endless chain of emails. The constant connectivity was suffocating, and I wanted nothing but silence and solitude. So I decided to I got my truck and drove into the vastness of the desert, far from any sign of civilization. The scenery was breathtaking. Immense red rock cliffs, endless expanses of sand, and a sky so wide and blue that it seemed unreal. As I drove along the winding dirt roads, I felt the tension in my shoulders begin to dissolve. I finally found the perfect spot, a small plateau overlooking a breathtaking valley with no other vehicles or camps in sight. The sun was beginning to set when I parked my truck and got out to stretch my legs. The air was fresh and dry, loaded with the aroma of dust and sage, Sylvestra. I took a deep breath, savoring the absence of noise. There were no car horns, no email notifications, no voices from coworkers, just the whisper of the wind and the distant song of some nocturnal bird. I lit a campfire and sat watching the sunset, the fiery hues of the sky reflecting off the rocks as darkness fell. The stars appeared in a staggering number, more than I had ever seen in my entire life. In the city, I stood there for hours with the Milky Way, feeling small and insignificant in the best possible way. When I finally got into the van to sleep, I felt at peace. No, I know what it was that awakened me. Maybe some primal survival instinct, that inexplicable feeling that something isn't right. I slammed my eyes open, my heart pounding in my chest. At first I heard nothing, then urgent low voices right outside my truck. I stood completely motionless, holding my breath. It couldn't be. I was in the middle of nowhere. Like hell there was someone here. Slide up to me. Phone, no signal. I cursed internally. Clear, that was the reason I had chosen this place in the first place. I wanted to disconnect now. That decision had left me completely vulnerable. With slow, controlled movements, I crawled to the window and barely lifted the corner of the curtain. My blood froze. There were 5 men outside dressed in dark clothes, armed, one of them holding a rifle. They were walking around my truck, checking it with lanterns, talking quietly. "Check inside," one of them said in a deep voice. My heart almost stopped. The handle of the door shook. They were going to go in. I had nowhere to run. I had no weapons. I didn't have how to call for help. I could only pray that they wouldn't be able to open the door. But then a metallic sound. The safety jumped. I held back a panicked cry when the door of the truck burst open and a bright light blinded me. "Look what we have here," said a mocking voice. Rough hands grabbed me and dragged me out of the van. I tried to resist, but one of them held me tightly by the arms and pushed me to the ground. "Please, Jade, I don't have anything valuable. Take what you want and let me go." One of the men, taller than the others, crouched in front of me. His face, I was in shadows, but I could feel the intensity of his. "We're not here for your money," he said with a terrifying calm. We're here because you saw something you shouldn't have." The confusion mixed with my terror. What I didn't see anything. "I don't know who you guys are." The man pulled my camera out of his pocket and held it in front of my face. "You have pictures of our cargo." My mind ran at full speed, then I remembered it more. Early that afternoon, while watching the sunset, I had noticed a small plane flying low over the desert. It had seemed strange to me. So I took a couple of photos of it without thinking too much about it, but I hadn't noticed that in the background of one of the images you could clearly see a group of men unloading boxes from the plane in a vehicle. I had witnessed an illegal exchange without realizing it, and now they knew. The man pulled out his gun and put it against my forehead. "Give me a reason not to blow your CISOs right here." Panic gripped my throat. I deleted the photos. I lied. I didn't know what I was drinking. It was just a sunset. I haven't shown this to anyone. The man didn't seem convinced, looked at one of his companions and nodded. "Record them that there are no copies," while they checked my truck for more evidence. My mind was working frantically. I knew how this was going to end. They couldn't let me go. No, after having seen their faces, if I didn't do something now, I wouldn't make it out alive tonight. I had to act. When the man holding me loosened my grip a little, I threw my head back with all my might, hitting him in the face. He growled in pain and let go of me reflexively. I seized the moment and ran like never before in my life. Heard screams behind me, the sound of hurried footsteps. The desert was vast and dark, but I couldn't stop. I could just keep going ahead, hoping luck was on my side. Then the lights, sirens, the police. My heart almost stopped. The flashlights lit up the desert, and I heard the men cursing before dispersing. A few minutes later, I felt firm hands holding me. "Is safe, miss." It was all over, but number wasn't over. I never knew exactly who those men were or what they were trafficking that night. The police found my wrecked truck, but they had disappeared without a trace ever since. Every time I drive on deserted roads, I get a chill. Sometimes I think I see a flash of lights in the rearview mirror or a motionless silhouette in the distance. I know that somewhere they are still out there, and I know that I should never have been in that desert. The moment he said it, I knew he was a fugitive. I knew that my quiet night in the boss that had become a nightmare. I had been looking forward to this solo camping trip for months. As a senior corporate lawyer in Seattle, my life was a constant whirlwind of meetings, files, and endless nights at the office. The thought of escaping to the solitude of the woods, even if it was only for a weekend, it was intoxicating. I chose a remote spot in the Cascade Mountains, far from the popular campgrounds. The hiking trails were the type of location you really had to look for, which was ideal for me because I wanted alone, a chance to think things through, and a chance to reconsider the choices I had made in my life. It had been a lovely drive, with the sprawl of the city giving way to snow-capped peaks and thick trees. My shoulders started to tense as I drove my vehicle on more constrained, bear-free highways. I arrived at the site just as the sun was starting to set. It was perfect, a small clearing surrounded by ancient trees with a bubbling stream nearby. I could already feel how the stress of the city was fading away. I set up camp, effectively years of practice, making the process almost automatic. When night fell, I sat outside the truck with a glass of wine in my hand, watching the stars appear one by one. One of the only sounds was the soft whisper of the wind through the trees and the distant hoot of an owl. For the first time in months, maybe years, I felt truly at peace. There was no phone signal, which meant there would be no emails or urgent messages from clients or colleagues. Just me, the night sky, and the immense tranquility of the forest. Must have fallen asleep at some point, lulled by the air-cool mountain and absolute stillness. A sound woke me up suddenly, a crunch like a branch breaking under a foot. Blinking, disoriented, and I looked at my watch. It was a few minutes past midnight. It was then that I saw him, a figure emerging from the shadows of the trees. My heart jumped to my throat. Who else could be here at this hour? As he got closer, I could make out more details. It was a man probably in his 30s, with scruffy hair and several days of beard covering his face. His clothes were dirty and torn, and in his eyes there was a frantic flash that gave me goosebumps. "Please," he said hoarsely, "and I need help." I slowly stood up, my mind working at full speed, every instinct telling me to get in my truck and get out of there as fast as I wanted. But something in his tone, in the raw desperation of his gaze, made me doubt what's going on. I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, "You're hurt?" He shook his head and looked nervously over his shoulder. "I'm not hurt, but I'm in trouble, big trouble." He took a deep breath and looked me in the eye. "I'm a fugitive. The police are looking for me." At that moment I felt as if the ground was opening up under my feet. I was miles away from civilization, face to face with a man who was on the run from the law. All the true crime episodes I had heard flashed through my mind in an instant. I haven't done anything wrong, he hurriedly added, noticing the fear on my face. I swear, they set me up, but you're not going to believe me. I had to hear part of me. I wanted to tell him to leave, threatened to call the police, but we both knew I had no way to do it without a cell phone signal, and another part of me, the same one who became a lawyer to fight for justice, couldn't help but be curious. Okay, I said slowly, why don't you sit down and tell me what happened? He dropped to the ground gratefully, the exhaustion evident in every line of his body, and then he started to speak. Mike's name was, and he had been an accountant at a mid-sized technology company in Portland. Months earlier he had noticed some discrepancies in the company's financial records, signs of large-scale embezzlement. When he took his occupations to his superiors, they assured him that they would investigate the matter. But nothing happened. The discrepancies continued to increase every month. Mike continued to dig in, collect evidence, build a case, and then, just as he was about to go to the authorities, everything went wrong. I got home one night and found my apartment destroyed, he said, his voice trembling with the memory. My laptop with all the evidence had disappeared and there was blood. A lot of blood. Panicked, he fled the next morning. He saw on the news that he was wanted for murder. His boss's body had been found in his apartment and all the evidence pointed to Mike as the murderer. But I didn't, he insisted, his eyes begging me to believe him. They set me up. They want to silence me before I could expose his fraud. As he spoke, I found myself believing him. Maybe it was the sincerity in his voice or the accuracy of his story. Or maybe it was simply that he wanted to believe that the world wasn't as corrupt as my years as a lawyer had led me to think. What you're going to do? I asked when it was over. A hand for matted hair, looking completely lost. I don't know. I've been running hard for weeks, staying off the grid, but I'm running out of options. I need to clear my name, but I don't know how. I took a deep breath, knowing I was about to make a decision that could change our lives forever. Maybe I can help you. I'm a lawyer. The hope that lit up his face was almost painful to really see. You believe me? I nodded slowly. I think so, but we have to be smart about this. If what you say is true, these people are dangerous and have connections. We spent the rest of the night planning. I couldn't get him back to Seattle with me. It would be too risky. But I had a colleague in Portland, someone I fully trusted, who might be willing to take on his case. When the sky began to clear with the first them. By dawn we already had a plan. Mike would stay hidden in the mountains while I went back to town, talk to my colleague, present Mike's case, and start working on his defense. It was a risk. If I was wrong about Mike, if he was really guilty, he could be ruining my career. But if I told the truth, this could be the biggest case of my life, and deep down I knew I had already once I made my decision. I had no idea what the next few days and weeks would bring. I didn't know if we would succeed or if we were headed straight for our ruin. But I did know one thing. My life would never be the same again. I never thought I would ever fear the sound of a knock on the door. But when it happened in the middle of the night, in the middle of nowhere, I knew that our lives were about to change forever. My wife Emily and I had planned this trip in our RV for months. We both worked in high-pressure environments. Me as a financial analyst and she as an emergency room nurse. We needed to disconnect. Get away from the city and enjoy the tranquility of the open road. The idea of touring the country with no fixed destination, no schedules or stress was too tempting to ignore. The first days were perfect. I drove without haste, exploring them remote from a forest. The camping app we used described it as a beautiful and peaceful place surrounded by tall pines and with a nearby stream. When we got there, we discovered that it was a paradise. The fresh air, the sound of running water, and the complete lack of other people made us feel as though we were in a different world. After dinner by the campfire, we sat down with a glass of wine and enjoyed the silence. Emily sighed, resting her head on my shoulder. Why don't we do this more often? I smiled and kissed her forehead. Perhaps it's time to reevaluate our priorities. We talked late and dreamed of a simpler, more carefree life. I'm not sure how long I'd slept, but when I heard 3 knocks on the RV door, I sat up right away. My mind was still in the haze of sleep, and I looked at Emily's wide eyes. "Open." "You heard that," she whispered. I nodded, my heart to hold her down. I looked at the clock. It was 2:13 in the morning. Who the hell would be here at this hour? The knock, it was repeated louder. This time slide me possible, and I approached the side window very carefully. I pushed the curtain back a little. There was someone there. A tall and thin male figure, barely illuminated by the moon, was standing by the door motionless. Panic began to grow in my chest. "Who is it?" he asked in a trembling whisper. I shook my head. "I don't know." The man banged on the door once again, this time with more insistence. "Hello," said a raspy voice from the other side. "Someone there? Please, I need help." I exchanged a look with Emily. I could see the internal struggle on her face. Her instinct as a nurse was telling her to help. But the situation, it was too strange. "What do we do?" she asked. I took a breath. "I'm going to see what she wants, but I won't open the door." She nodded nervously as I approached and talked through the closed door. "What does the man need?" She was silent for a moment. "I had an accident on the road," she finally said. "My car went off the road. I need help." Something in her tone made me doubt. It didn't sound scared or hurt. It sounded strange. "Where is your car?" I asked. A second of pause. "Further down the bend." "I think I broke my arm." Your answer didn't make sense. There was no curve nearby. My instinct yelled at me that something was wrong. "I'm sorry, but we can't help you. We can call 911 for you." Silence, then a low laugh. "There's no signal here." We both know. A chill ran down my spine. Emily squeezed my arm tightly. "Don't open it," whispered, like if the man had heard her. He banged on the door harder. "Come on, buddy. I just need to go in for a moment. Make a call. Don't be like this." Now yes, fear completely invaded me. He hadn't mentioned that we were in an RV. He couldn't see us. So how did I know? I backed away slowly, pointing to Emily to move to the back of the vehicle. "We can't help him," I repeated, trying to keep my voice steady. The man snorted. "Well, if you don't want to open, I guess I'll have to do it myself." The sound of the handle spinning made me panic. I was trying to get in. I ran to the kitchen, where we kept a big knife for cooking. Emily took the pepper spray out of her bag. "What do we do, Jade?" The man shook the door harder. Then another sound chilled our blood. Multiple steps. It wasn't just a man there, further outside. Emily began to hyperventilate. "We have to get out of here," I whispered. My mind was working at full throttle. If we tried to turn on the RV, they could block our exit or break a window. Before we hurriedly ripped it outside. And then the sound of footsteps moving away. A few seconds later, the roar of a car accelerating and disappearing into the distance. I froze. Only when everything was completely silent, I dared to open the door. There was no one or a trace of them. If it hadn't been for the footprints in the dirt around the RV, I would have thought I'd imagined it. Emily and I didn't sleep the rest of the night. At dawn, we turned on the and walked out of there without looking back. We never knew who those men were or what they really wanted. But one thing was for sure, they weren't there by accident. Since then, we don't camp in isolated places. We don't enjoy the silence of the night as much anymore, because we now know that in the dark there are those who wait. And next time we may not be so lucky. The moment I felt the hand covering my mouth, I knew that my peaceful getaway to the desert had become a struggle to survive. I had dreamed of this solo trip to the New Mexico desert for months as a nurse in Chicago. My life was a constant chaos of monitors beeping, critically ill patients, and life or death decisions. I was physically and mentally exhausted, and the idea of getting lost in the immensity of the desert, far from everything, seemed to me the only way to regain my balance. I had chosen a secluded place, far from tourist camps and marked routes, a corner of the earth where civilization was barely an eye. I remember the loneliness calling to me like a siren song. The journey there had been almost therapeutic. I left behind the skyscrapers and the endless traffic, watching as the landscape transformed into arid plains and, finally, into the unearthly beauty of the desert. As I drove my truck on increasingly irregular roads and without signage, I felt how the tightness in my chest began to loosen. I arrived at my destination at sunset, the sky, day in orange and pink tones, reflecting its fire on the reddish rocks. The place was perfect, a small plateau overlooking an endless sea of sand and rock formations. For the first time in a long time, I breathed deeply and felt peace. I set up camp with the precision of someone who has dreamed of this moment for too long. When night fell, I sat next to my truck with a beer in my hand. Marvel at me. With a sky so full of stars that it seemed unreal. No phones, no strenuous shifts, no emergencies. Just me, the vastness of the desert, and the wind whispering between the rocks. I must have fallen asleep without realizing it. A noise woke me up suddenly. The creaking of footing on the sand, blinking disoriented, and I looked at my watch. It was a few minutes past midnight. It was then that I saw them, dark figures emerging from the shadows, moving with stealth, approaching my truck. Fear paralyzed me. Who could be here in the middle of nowhere at this time? I didn't have time to react before I could move. Strong hands grabbed me from behind. One closed over my mouth, silencing my scream, while another pins my arms against my body. "Don't move," whispered a harsh voice in my ear. "Don't make noise." I froze, my heart beating so strong that I felt that it was going to explode. This could not be happening. Not here, not in this remote corner of the world where I had come to find peace. More figures approached. There were at least 5 men, their faces hidden in the gloom, moved with precision. Without talking too much, "What do we do with her?" asked one of them, the one who was holding me. Clearly the leader hesitated for an instant. I felt the tension in his body, the doubt in its grip. "We took it away," it decided. "Finally, we can't leave witnesses." My mind raced. Witnesses of what? What they had been doing. Dragged me into a group of vehicles I hadn't noticed before. ATVs parked in the shadow of a rock formation. Put me in the back of one of them, tying my hands quickly. As the engine roared and we sped away, I felt my world. I was falling apart. I was being kidnapped and no one knew where I was. The trip was endless. The truck shook on the uneven turf, and with each boat my fear grew. I tried to memorize the way to orient myself, but everything in the dark seemed the same. Sand, rocks, more sand. When we finally stopped, they took me out of the vehicle abruptly. We were in a small canyon. Its high rock walls hiding it from the place. Something made me hold my breath. A small matte black plane, almost invisible in the night. My pulse quickened even more. "Move," the leader ordered. The men began to unload bags from the vans and carry them to the plane with alarming coordination. They knew exactly what they were doing. Drug smugglers. I felt my body tremble. I had fallen in the middle of something much bigger than I could comprehend. The leader approached me. Now I could see him well. An old man with a weathered face with scars that spoke of a dangerous life. "What's your name?" he asked. I swallowed hard. "Sarah," managed to murmur. He nodded as if confirming something good. "Sarah, you've gotten us in trouble. We can't let you go." Terror paralyzed me. "I haven't seen anything," I begged. "I don't know who they are or what they're doing. I'm just a nurse from Chicago on vacation. Please, let me go." The man sighed as if he really regretted the situation. "I wish it were that simple." Sarah, one of her men, came already. "Boss, we are late." The leader nodded and looked at me again. "It seems that you are coming with us, but calm down. We will not hurt you." "No." If the implicit meaning of those words froze my blood. They pushed me towards the plane. My hands were still tied. My mind was spinning uncontrollably. I was about to be taken away, who knows where, by a group of criminals, and no one would come to look for me. The engine roared and the plane took off, soaring over the vast darkness of the desert. Through the window I saw the dunes and rocks shrinking until they were like distant shadows where they were taking me. I must have fallen asleep from sheer exhaustion. When I woke up, the plane was descending outside. Instead of the desert, I saw a dense forest. I had no idea where we were, but one thing was for sure. I was very, very far from home. When we landed on a clandestine airstrip in the middle of nowhere, the leader came over and untied my hands. "We're going to let you go, Sarah. But listen well." He bent his dark eyes, staring into mine. "We know who you are. We know where you live, where you work. If you talk to anyone, we'll know and find you." My throat closed. I nodded, too terrified to talk. They abandoned me there in that remote place while the plane took off again. It took me 2 days to find help, walking aimlessly without food or water until I got to a small town. When I finally called the police, I lied. I said I had gotten lost on a hike. The truth was too dangerous. I never went back to Chicago. I moved to a town in Montana. I changed my name, my appearance, my life, but I never forgot that night in the desert, and sometimes in my darkest moments I think I hear the hum of an engine in the distance looking for me. The moment I saw the unknown van, I knew we had made a terrible mistake. Our search for solitude had led us straight into a nightmare. My best friend Sarah and I had planned this trip for months. We were both exhausted from our high-pressure jobs in the city. I as a software engineer, she as a corporate lawyer, needed to escape, disconnect from the world, and recharge. We chose the Appalachian Mountains for our getaway, attracted by the promise of spectacular views and total seclusion. Sarah found a website that provided GPS coordinates of remote camping spots off the beaten track. It seemed perfect, a way to get away from it all without the hassle of mass camping. We set off early, Friday morning, with my old Subaru loaded with gear and a week's worth of provisions. The trip was beautiful, with winding roads taking us deeper and deeper into the world. The mountains. As the cell phone signal disappeared, I felt the weight of routine begin to fade. In the middle of the afternoon we arrived at the detour to our destination. The dirt road was narrow and rugged in the mountains, but the view was worth it, a landscape of endless forests and peaks covered in fog. It stretched as far as the eye could see. "This is incredible," sighed Sarah, leaning out of the window. "I can't believe that we have this whole place to ourselves." I smiled, feeling more relaxed than I had been in months. "I know. It's perfect." We found our spot just as the sun was starting to go down. It was a small clearing protected by tall pines with a murmuring stream a short distance away. We couldn't have asked for a more idyllic setting. We set up camp with ease, working together to pitch the tent and gather firewood. As night fell, we sat by the fire roasting marshmallows and talking like in the old days. Only the crackling of and the soft murmur of the creek broke the stillness. We should do this more often. Sarah leaned back in her chair with an expression of satisfaction. She had forgotten how good it feels to just be nodding, feeling the same totally. Maybe it's time to rethink our priorities. We stay up late watching the sky clear and full of stars. Fascinate me by how bright it was without the light pollution of the city. When we finally got into the store, I fell asleep almost immediately to the freshness of the mountain air and the absolute tranquility. I don't know what time it was when I woke up. Something roused me from sleep. I stood motionless for a moment, trying to identify what had changed. Then I heard it, the crunch of wheels on gravel. I sat up, my heart beginning to beat hard. "Sarah," I whispered, shaking it sleepily. "What is impossible? We are in the middle of nowhere." But then she heard it too. An engine, a car door opening, voices. We hurried out of the tent. The night was cold. The moon cast long shadows on the clearing, on the edge of the forest. A few meters from our camp, there was an old dusty truck parked. 3 men were standing next to her, talking quietly. One of them looked up and saw us. "Look," nothing else said, his voice echoing in the night. "What are 2 girls doing alone around here?" My stomach sank. This wasn't well. "We're just camping," I replied, trying to stay calm. "We didn't know this place was occupied." The men started walking towards us. I could see them more clearly now. Worn clothes, rough faces, predatory looks. "This is an interesting place to camp," said the one who seemed to be the leader, a tall man with a scruffy beard. "Far, far away from any help." My pulse went up. "We have no problems," Sarah said in a firm voice. "We can pack up and leave right now." The man smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. "Oh, no hurry," he said. "Maybe we can share the camp. What do they say?" Sarah and I exchanged a "we were in danger." We slowly backed away to our tent. "Let's go to sleep," I said, forcing a smile to rest. The men looked at each other and began to laugh. "Sure, of course," said the leader. "See you later, girls." We got into the tent and lowered our voices. "We have to get out of here," I whispered now. Sarah nodded, pale, with as much silence as possible. We picked up the essentials: keys, flashlights, camping knives. We left the tent stuck together to the ground, moving towards the car without turning on the lights. The truck was still there. The men were nearby waiting for us. Sarah and I looked at each other. There was only one option. We ran. The men screamed behind us. I heard hurried footsteps, the sound of branches breaking. We arrived at the car just as they were catching up with us. Sarah threw her backpack on the seat while I turned the key. The engine didn't start. "Come on, come on," Jade Sarah hitting the dashboard. I turned the key. Again, nothing. "Can't be." I let go in desperation. A hand hit the window. One of the men looked at us with a wicked smile. "Car trouble, girls." My blood froze. Then suddenly a loud searchlight lit up the clear, screaming voices. The men turned around in surprise, then ran to their truck and disappeared into the night. A few seconds later, a patrol car appeared. An officer approached to our car. "Fine. We got a tip about suspicious activity in the area." I didn't know who had called, but at the time I didn't care. Shaking, I nodded. We left that same night. Later we learned that the men were local criminals who used the forest for their own purposes. They never got caught. Since then we no longer look for lonely places to camp, because we learned that in the darkness of the forest you are never really alone. The moment I realized Paul was gone, I knew our romantic getaway had turned into something much more sinister. We'd been looking forward to this trip for months. Our relationship had become strained, frayed by the pressure of our jobs in New York. Paul, a successful investment banker, and I, a corporate lawyer, barely had time to see each other. And when we did, we almost always ended up arguing. This weekend was our chance to reconnect, to reminisce why we'd been together for so long. We'd chosen a secluded cabin in the Adirondacks, a rustic but cozy retreat in the middle of the woods. Miles separated us from the nearest neighbor, something that at the time seemed perfect to me. No emails, no work calls, just the two of us. The drive there was filled with uncomfortable silence. Paul and I had had another argument before leaving, the same old one. He worked too much, me too. Neither of us made enough effort to save the relationship, but when we arrived, the cabin was just like in the pictures, a wooden construction with a stone fireplace and a panoramic view of the forest. Maybe this weekend could really save us. The first night was uneventful. We opened a bottle of wine. We sat on the porch and We watched the sunset for a moment. I felt things go back to the way they were before. Paul even smiled for real without the shadow of exhaustion that always seemed to be on his face. But when night fell, the old problems resurfaced. "You are still obsessed with work," he said after a long silence. "Seriously?" I replied in disbelief. "You tell me that if someone is married to their job, that's you?" He blurted out a bitter laugh, and he shook his head. "I can't go on like this, Sarah." This gestured between us. "It just doesn't work." A knot formed in my stomach. "What are you saying?" Paul sighed, rubbing his face with his hands. "I don't know, just I need a break." He got up suddenly and took his jacket. "I'm going for a walk." Before I could answer, he went out the door. I stood watching him disappear between the trees, feeling a mixture of anger and worry. I knew he needed space when he was frustrated, but this forest was not the best place to walk at night. Anyway, I tried to calm down, cleared the table, put the dishes in the sink, and tried to ignore the restlessness that grew in my chest. An hour passed, then 2 at midnight. The worry had already turned to panic. Paul hadn't returned. I got a jacket, I took a flashlight, and went out into the forest, calling it again and again. "Paul, where are you?" The forest returned me, only the murmur of the wind through the trees and the distant sound of an owl. Something was wrong. Paul would never have been so far out, not without warning. When the dawn began to dye the sky pale tones, I returned to the cabin, shivering with cold and fear. I needed to call the police. I ran to. I looked for my phone, but it had no signal. I tried the cabin's landline. Silence. We were completely incommunicado. Panic closed my throat. I tried to rationalize the situation. Maybe Paul had gotten lost in the dark and I was trying to find my way back. Maybe I would come back at any time, apologizing for scaring me. But then I saw his wallet and keys on the bedside table. He hadn't taken anything. Yes, would have gone away. Would have taken his wallet. This meant he didn't plan to be away for long, or he never had a chance to go back. Checking the cabin for clues, I found something that made me stop. In dry, a small crumpled piece of paper, as if it had been written in a hurry. I recognized it immediately. Paul's handwriting. "If anything happens to me, check the old well behind the cabin." My skin stood on end. The old well stood on end. I didn't remember seeing it when we arrived, but if Paul had written this, something was terribly wrong. It went outside. The flashlight trembling in my hand, I circled the cabin until I saw it. The well, covered of moss and weeds, seemed abandoned decades ago. I approached cautiously and looked inside. Black. I saw nothing. "Paul," I called, my voice just a whisper. Silence. But then something reflected the light of my flashlight. A metal object at the bottom of the well. My heart was pounding. I went to the shed and found a rope with trembling hands. I tied it to a nearby tree, and with all the fear in the world I started as the air descended into the well. It smelled of damp and old earth. When I reached the bottom, I saw the object that had shone with the light, a metal briefcase. With effort I opened it. Documents, photographs, and when I checked its contents, the horror hit me like a blow in the stomach. Paul had not been working late all those nights. He had been investigating something somewhat dangerous. The documents in the briefcase showed evidence of large-scale fraud in his investment firm, corruption, money laundering. Names of influential people involved. Paul had discovered too much, and now my thoughts were gone. They were interrupted by the sound of tires on the gravel. I froze from the bottom of the well. I could see lights flickering in the darkness, a vehicle, multiple doors opening, voices. Someone had arrived, and they weren't rescuers. I had no time to lose. I took the briefcase and started to climb up hurriedly, ignoring the pain in my hands. When I got to the top, I crouched behind some bushes and observed a black E-sub. It was parked in front of the cabin. 2 men in suits came down. One of them took out his phone. "She is still here. Find me." She paralyzed. They were not here to help. They came to get me. They knew that I had found something, and now I was the next target. I crept away through the trees. I had no plan or where I was going. I just knew I couldn't let them catch me. I ran aimlessly without thinking, just moving as fast as possible through the brush. Behind me I heard screams are escaping, the sound of branches breaking. They followed me. My breathing was choppy. My heart was beating in my chest. Paul had disappeared to discover the truth, and now that truth could cost me my life. But I didn't think I would give up. I would keep running for Paul, for the truth, for justice. No matter what I had to do, I was going to find them and make them pay. The sound of glass breaking. It brought me out of a deep sleep. As I opened my eyes in the darkness of my cabin, I knew I wasn't alone. I had come here seeking peace as a paramedic in a big city. My life was full of emergencies, sirens, and chaos. I needed to disconnect at least for a while. Like that, I rented a small cabin in the Rocky Mountains, far from everything and everyone. No cell signal, no internet, just nature and silence. The first days were perfect. I walked the nearby trails, read by the fireplace, and slept better than in years. I felt refreshed, as if I could finally breathe. But on the third night something changed. I woke up with a strange feeling, as if someone was watching me. I remained motionless in bed, listening to nothing, probably just my imagination. Yet the feeling lingered throughout the day. Every time I went out I felt eyes on me. I looked around the forest but never saw anything. I told myself it was nerves. I was too used to noise and people until the fourth night came. The sound of broken glass made me jump in bed, my heart pounding as I tried to comprehend what I had heard. Someone was inside the cabin. I held my breath and squeezed me slip that I had left nearby. I advanced cautiously towards the door of my room, trying to remember if I had left the front door locked. I felt my blood freeze as I peered through the gap and saw that there was a person standing in the room. The shape was tall and slender, and while I couldn't see it fully, it was moving slowly and seemingly purposefully, as if I were checking the area out. I swallowed hard, trying to detect whether I was still. Maybe he would go, presuming the cabin was deserted. Then the ground creaked under my feet. The entire froze for a moment. The silence was absolute, and then he turned to me. The moonlight came in through the window, illuminating his face. My stomach churned. I had no eyes. There was skin, Lisa, where they should be, like she's never had them. Her mouth twisted into a twisted smile. Finally awake, she whispered, panicked me, shook me, slammed the door shut and turned the lock. Heard her footsteps rushing towards me, banged on the door with brutal force. "Let me in," said her cold, slurred voice. "I just want to see you." I stepped back, my heart pounding in my chest, looked around the room looking for a way out. I could escape through the window. I ran to it and yanked it open. The cold mountain air hit my face, but before I could jump, the door shook with another bang. "Don't go," said the voice on the other end. "We've waited too long. We've already waited too long." We've shivered down my spine. I wasn't alone. I turned my head and saw something move in the window outside in the dark. There was more figures, 4, 5, maybe more, standing in the woods, motionless, looking in my direction. My breathing became erratic. I had to get out of there. I grabbed the knife harder, climbed on the windowsill and jumped, fell into the snow and rolled to cushion the blow. As soon as I sat up, I felt movement behind me. I ran the branches, scratched my face. The cold burned my lungs, but I didn't stop. I could hear it following me. I ran until I saw the road. My car was there waiting for me like a lifeline. I pulled the keys out of my pocket with trembling hands, feeling the icy breath of something behind me, threw myself into the driver's seat, closed the door and turned the key. The engine didn't start. Desperation took over me. I tried again. Nothing. I looked in the rearview mirror, and there they were standing in the rearview mirror, watching me. One of them, the same twisted smile, approached, pale skin in the moonlight. I closed my eyes and turned the key one last time. The engine roared alive. I stepped on the gas and shot off. I didn't look back. I drove without stopping until I saw the city lights. I had no idea who those things were, what they wanted, or why they had chosen me. I just know thing. I'll never go back to the mountain. Never. I'll go back to the cabin, and every night before I go to sleep I close all the doors and windows, because in the darkness, in the silence, I feel like they're still looking for me. The moment I saw Kevin's eyes, I knew our meeting had become a death trap. We had planned this weekend for months. After years of being busy with our lives and careers, we were finally going to meet again. We were 5, Tom, Sarah, Dan, Kevin and I, in college. Had been inseparable, but life, as always, had pulled us in different directions. It was Tom who had the idea to rent a cabin in the woods, a weekend with no distractions. He said, like in the old days, I thought it was a great idea. I needed a break from the routine of the city, from everything, so I accepted. What I didn't know was that this trip was going to turn into a nightmare. When I got to the cabin, Tom was already there. Alex screamed with a smile, hugging me tight. "You don't change anything, friend." The cabin was everything I had promised, rustic with a big fireplace and a porch that looked out onto an endless forest. Sarah and Dan arrived soon after. We laughed and drank and shared stories of our years apart. Everything was perfect until Kevin arrived. Kevin had always been the most unpredictable of the group in college. His brilliance was matched only by his instability. His mind seemed to be going 1,000 an hour, always restless, always looking for something else he had dropped out of the career in the last year. After that, his life became a mystery. We had drifted apart, but now he was here. When he walked through the door, I noticed that there was something strange about him. He was thinner, with sunken eyes and a look that got on my nerves. "Kevin," I waved, trying to sound cheerful. Alex responded, smiling. But his eyes said something else. That first night was perfect. We toasted to the old days, we cooked together, we remembered our college craziness. For a moment I was convinced that everything was okay, but then Kevin talked. They remember the last party before we graduated. The laughter died down. We all remembered that night, a big fire in the beach, lots of alcohol, laughs, and Kevin left me there, he said quietly. I fainted and you left me. An awkward silence filled the cabin. Kevin started. Tom, we were drunk, we searched everywhere. We thought you had left with someone. Kevin smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. They left me behind, and after that everything changed. The next morning it seemed normal again, but I couldn't shake the uneasiness of head. Something wasn't right. We went for a walk in the woods. Kevin was silently lagging behind the group when we got to a cliff with a breathtaking view. He spoke. I think it's time we talked about why we're here. We turned to him. We're here to spend time together, Sarah nervously. Kevin shook his head. We're here because it's time to do justice. He pulled out a gun. The world Kevin seemed to stop. Kevin began. Dan, in a trembling voice, what are you doing? Kevin pointed the gun at us. My whole life has been a disaster since that night, he said as you moved forward. I was trapped. His voice was shaking with rage. Today that change made us return to the cabin, forced us to sit on the floor, walked in front of us, his gaze burning with a mixture of pain and resentment. Let's play a game, said, a game of truth or consequence. No one spoke. If they lie, shot. We looked at each other, terrified. Sarah, you first, said, pointing at me. Tell me the worst thing you've done. Sarah, Los, I had an affair, confessed in tears. I betrayed my husband. Kevin nodded. Well, give your turn. Dan swallowed hard. I've stolen money for my job. Tom hesitated, but in the end he spoke. I betrayed my best friend for a promotion. Kevin turned to me. Alex, your turn. My mind was spinning. I knew I wanted him to say. I knew this was my only chance. I took a breath and let him out in a whisper. Kevin, I'm sorry. Kevin blinked as if he wasn't expecting those words. What did you say? I feel, I repeated with a broken voice. I don't know why we didn't come back to look for you. I don't know why we abandoned you. But we did, and we failed you. The gun in your hand trembled. You ruined my life, he muttered. I know, I said. But this won't fix anything. He closed his eyes for a second. And then Tom lunged at him. A shot rang through the cabin. Tom fell to the ground moaning in pain. Sarah screamed. Dan, see, he froze. I took advantage of the distraction. I threw myself on Kevin, hitting his hand with all my might. The gun fell to the ground. Dan finally reacted and joined me. Between the two of us we managed to immobilize him. Kevin was sobbing, his body shaken by tremors. He just wanted them to understand. He whispered. He just wanted them to know what it felt like when the paramedics arrived and the police were all over. Tom survived. Kevin was arrested. But something inside of us died that night. What we had been, what we had shared, everything was shattered. We had gathered to reminisce about the old days, but what we found was the weight of the past. A past that we had tried to forget and that almost killed us. The first shot echoed in the night, breaking the calm of the forest. It was then that I knew we were in danger. My older brother David and I had planned this trip for months. Since we were children, camping had been our tradition, but with adult life we had drifted apart. He became a firefighter, I became a graphic designer. Our schedules never matched. We finally managed to organize for a weekend in the mountains of Colorado, away from the stress of the city. The trip was perfect. We found a secluded site near a lake, pitched our tent and lit a fire while we were marshmallows. We reminisced about old stories and laughed like when we were kids. There was no one else for miles around, or so we thought. The first sign that something was wrong came around midnight. David and I were sitting by the fire when we heard a scream in the distance. We looked at each other. Alert, you heard that? I asked with a tight stomach. David nodded. It looks like someone needs help. We stood up, trying to locate the source of the sound, but the forest was dense and the echo made it impossible to tell where it was coming from. The scream sounded again, this time clearer. Please help. It was a desperate male voice. David grabbed a flashlight and his camp knife. I'm going to see, and if it's a trap. I whispered. Something in my instinct told me not to go. David looked at me in disbelief. And if anyone is really in danger? I sighed and took my flashlight. It's okay, but we stay together. We go into the woods following the approximate direction of the scream. We walk for about 5 minutes without hearing anything else. Then the silence was broken by a gunshot. We froze. Another shot too close. David turned off the flashlight and pushed me behind a tree. He went back to the camp, he whispered. But before we could move, a voice screamed. I saw him there behind the tree. Terror ran through my body. They were hunting us. David grabbed my arm and ran. We heard more shots behind us, bullets breaking, branches silhouetting near us. The camp was too far away. We could only hide. We swerved down the hill deeper into the darkness. We heard footsteps following us, heavy and hurried. We threw ourselves behind a large rock and held our breath. The men passed within a few yards of us. One of them had a rifle. "I'm sure that there were two," said a hoarse voice. "It doesn't matter," another answered. "If they're here, they know too much." My hands were shaking. David and I looked at each other. We didn't need to speak to understand him. If they found us, we wouldn't get out alive. We waited until the footsteps moved away. Then we moved cautiously in the opposite direction. The problem was that we were disoriented. We didn't know where to run. Then David whispered, "Look at that a few meters away." Hidden among the trees there was a cabin with a dim light inside. "It could be our salvation," I whispered. "Or a trap," David answered. But we had no choice. We crept up and looked out the window. Inside there were boxes piled up, weapons, drugs. Horror hit me like a fist. We had stumbled upon a smuggling camp. David grabbed my arm and signaled me to back up. But then a snap under my foot, a broken branch. The door of the cabin burst open there. David and I ran out. We heard screams and more shots. The adrenaline drove me to continue, although my legs wanted to fail. Then in the darkness I saw a cave here. Jade, we threw ourselves inside just as a bullet hit the rock next to the entrance. The interior, it was cold and damp. We groped our way until we could no longer see the entrance. We remained silent, waiting. The men stopped outside the cave. "They can't go far," one said. "It doesn't matter," another. "We'll block the exit. If they don't get out, they'll die in here." My stomach sank. They were serious. We heard rocks falling. They were sealing us inside. David grabbed my shoulder. "We have to find another way out." We went into the cave, moving forward to harvest. After what seemed like hours, we found a tiny opening. We crawled through she and emergency hymos on the other side of the mountain. The sun was beginning to rise. We had survived. We ran without stopping until we found a road. When a pickup truck passed, we signaled desperately. The driver, a kind old man, picked us up. When we arrived at the nearest police station and gave our testimony, the officer seemed surprised. "They are not the first to tell something like this," said one of them. "Those men have been operating in the area for years. But I never knew if they were the only ones. I only know that David and I never camped again, and every time I see a clearing in the woods, I feel a twinge of fear because I know they're still out there." The moment I saw Derek's car in the driveway, I knew that my peaceful retreat had become a dangerous game of cat and mouse. I had chosen this cabin in the middle of the woods as my refuge, a place to heal and reconnect after our tumultuous breakup. Derek and I had been together for 5 years, a relationship that began with passion and promises, but over time became suffocating. What at first seemed like gestures of love and concern soon morphed into control. I drifted away from my friends, my family, and slowly from myself. When I finally found the courage to quit, it was like waking up from a nightmare. This cabin belonged to my aunt, an eccentric artist who spent most of her time traveling. When I called her, desperate for a place to disappear for a while, she didn't hesitate to get there. I arrived in late autumn. The forest was dyed reddish and gold tones, and the cabin with its wraparound porch and large windows felt like a sanctuary. I spent my days walking among the trees, reading books that I had put off for years and enjoying the solitude. No one knew I was here, just my closest friends and my aunt. For the first time in a long time, I felt safe until I saw Derek's car was parked next to mine. His shiny black Audi clashing with the rustic surroundings. My heart stopped for an instant. How I had found myself. Before I could react, I heard the bang on the door. Emily, her voice soft but firm. "I know you're there. I just want to talk." My hands were shaking as I put the cup of coffee on the table. My first instinct was to run, hide. But I knew that wouldn't do. Useless. "Derek, he wasn't going to leave." "Derek," I said, trying to sound firm, "I don't want to see you." Silence, then a sigh. "I won't leave until we talk. Please." I looked at my phone. I didn't have a signal. Cabin was too isolated to rely on coverage. I took a deep breath. 5-minute swipe and opened the door just enough to see him. He looked different, thinner. His normally flawless hair was messy. He had deep dark circles. "Thanks," he said, hoarse. "Only I need you to hear me speak from there," I replied without opening the door anymore. He nodded, putting his hands in his pockets. "I know I hurt you," he said. "I understand now. I was too controlling. I didn't know how to manage my emotions. But I love you, Emily. I've been going to therapy. I'm changing." I felt a knot in my stomach. "I'm glad you're working on yourself, but that doesn't change anything." It's over. His jaw tensed. "I can't accept that, not after everything we lived together." "Well, you have to," I said coldly. "Get out." Derek, for a second I saw something dark cross his gaze. Then he sighed, raising his hands in surrender. "It's okay. I'll go." He turned around, walked to his car and got in. I watched him until he disappeared down the road, but the restlessness in my chest He didn't go away that night. I slept badly. I woke up with every sound, every creak of the wood. The next morning when I opened the door, my blood froze. There was a bouquet of red roses on the porch and a note. "I'll never give up with us." It fell out of my hands. I ran inside, closed all the doors and windows, called the police. But without proof of a direct threat, there was little they could do if he comes back. At least, they said, that didn't calm me down. The following days were hell. My tires woke up flat. I found podded stuck on the windows with the same phrase, "We belong." One night I woke up feeling that someone was watching me. When I looked outside, I saw a silhouette among the trees. Derek grabbed my phone, ready to call the police. But when I looked again, I was gone. I knew I had to. I left. I called my brother and told him everything. "I'm coming for you tomorrow," he said. "She won't be alone." I felt a little safer. I just had to put up with one more night packing. Times when I finally went to bed. I was exhausted. I woke up to a noise, a creaking on the floor of the room. Fear paralyzed me. I wasn't alone before I could move. A hand closed over my mouth. "I told you I don't know." I was done. He whispered something in me. He exploded. Fear turned into rage. With all my strength I elbowed him in the stomach. Derek growled, staggering. I ran to the door, but he caught my arm. "Emily, listen to me," he screamed. I kicked him in the shin and I pulled away. I ran out of the cabin without looking back. The forest was dark, but I didn't stop. I heard his footsteps behind me. "Emily, don't run." But I didn't stop. Yes, I did. It was a miracle that I noticed the lights of a vehicle on the road after running like never before. A vehicle went past as I flung myself onto the road. My terrified visage was illuminated by the headlights. In dry, the car came to a halt. The elderly lady who was driving lowered down the window. I pleaded, "Help me, you're okay." She opened the door for me without hesitation, and I entered. I turned to look at the trees and saw that Derek was gone. The vehicle had slid out of sight. That nightmare, I didn't see Derek again after that night, but the fear stayed. I moved far away. I changed my number, but sometimes on sleepless nights I think I see his silhouette among the trees, waiting, watching, waiting for the perfect moment to return. The scream that pierced the night air turned my peaceful camping trip into a living nightmare. I never imagined that my search for solitude would lead me to witness something so scary. I had been planning this solo trip for months. As an English teacher in high school, my life was full of noise. The constant murmur of students, the shrill ringing of bells, the incessant ping of emails. I needed silence, a moment to listen to my own thoughts. The place I chose was perfect, a small, secluded campsite near a serene lake in Northern California. I was away from the main roads, requiring an hour-long hike from where I left my car. That extra effort guaranteed that I would be completely alone, away from the RVs and family campers that occupied the most accessible areas. When I pitched my tent that afternoon, I felt the tension in my shoulders begin to dissipate. The air was fresh, permeated with the scent of pine and wildflowers. Birds were singing in the distance, and I could hear the gentle splash of the lake against the shore. Was exactly what I needed. I spent the day walking around, admiring the views and enjoying the tranquility. At dusk, I lit a small fire and sat next to it, reading a book that had been postponing for months. The crackling of flames and the occasional hoot of an owl were the only sounds that broke the perfect silence near midnight. I decided to go to sleep. I carefully turned off the eye, slipped into my sleeping bag with a sigh of satisfaction. Despite the hardness of the ground, I fell asleep almost instantly, lulled by the stillness of the forest. I don't know how long it had been when the sound woke me up. At first I thought it was part of a dream, a high-pitched, prolonged moan that gave me goosebumps. But as I lay there with my heart pounding, I heard it again. This time there was no doubt. It was a human scream. I sat up, suddenly fumbling for my flashlight. With trembling hands, the scream resounded once louder, this time loaded with despair. It came from the direction of the lake. For an instant I froze, indecision paralyzed. I should investigate or stay in the tent and hope that everything would be resolved. Only the rational part of my brain told me that I was alone in the woods, with no signal on my cell phone and no way to call for help, and I was getting into trouble. But then the scream rang out again, this time with words, "Help, please someone help me." I couldn't ignore it. Whatever it was, someone was in danger. I had to try to help with shaky fingers. I put on my boots and jacket, grabbed my flashlight and a little gas canister. I took a deep breath to calm my nerves, unbuttoned the tent, and night came out. The forest felt different in the darkness. The trees that during the day seemed cozy now rose like menacing shadows. their branches spreading like gnarled fingers. The ha of my lantern seemed insignificant against the enveloping blackness. I advanced cautiously towards the lake, straining my ears to catch any sound for a long moment. All I could hear was my own gasping breath and the rustling of the leaves under my feet. Just as I was beginning to think I had imagined it all, I heard a splash followed by a muffled scream. I quickened El Paso, trudging aside a tangle of bushes as it emerged from the lake. My flashlight swept the surface of the water, reflecting eerie flashes in the small waves, and then I saw them, two figures in the water about 50 m from the shore. One of them was struggling frantically, waving her arms in panic. The other seemed to be holding her underwater. "Hey!" I shouted with a voice trembling with fear. "What's going on there?" For an instant, everything stopped. The figure that was writhing stood still. The other slowly turned her head, and I saw the reflection of two eyes shining in the ace of my flashlight. Then, with impossible speed, the figure began to move towards the shore, towards me. Panic enveloped me. I backed away awkwardly, almost tripping over a rock. In my haste, my mind screamed at me to run, to go back to my store, to my car, to safety. But my legs felt like lead, and I couldn't take my eyes off the silhouette that was getting closer and closer as I emerged from the walls. Shallow waters, I could make out more details. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man. He moved with unnatural grace, gliding through the water with hardly any noise, and his eyes were not normal. They had no visible sclera, only an absolute, deep and unfathomable black. As soon as he stepped on the mainland, I finally found the strength to react. I turned and ran through the forest, feeling the branches scratch my face, roots trying to make me fall. I could hear it behind me, moving much faster than it should be possible. My tent was close. I just had to reach for icy fingers. They closed over my shoulder, spun me around. I came face to face with my pursuer closely. He looked almost normal, a man in his 40s with hair between Kano and a well-groomed beard. But his eyes were completely black. "Wow," he said in a surprisingly soft voice. "This is unfortunate. I hate having witnesses." I tried to scream, but no sound came out of my mouth. He tilted his head. "As you should have stayed in your tent," he said with an almost amused tone. "Humans are always so nosy. They always have to investigate what you are." I managed to stammer. He smiled, revealing teeth a little too sharp. "I'm hungry," he whispered, "and you, darling, you look absolutely delicious." Survival instinct took over. Without thinking, I raised my hand and pressed the trigger of the pepper spray directly into his face. The scream he let out was not human. His grip loosened, and I took the opportunity. One ran, feeling the burning of fear in my lungs. I don't remember much of that frantic race through the forest, but somehow, driven by panic and adrenaline, I found my way back to my car. My hands were shaking so much I could barely get the key into it intact. Finally, the engine roared alive. I drove without stopping to the nearest city, where I entered, staggering. Too dark, or I hear a voice too soft on the radio, and the terror returns. Now I prefer the noise and bustle of the city, because in the silence, in the dark, is where the real monsters lurk. The package without a return arrived on a Tuesday, inside wrapped in paper, crumpled newspaper. There was a small black device that would shatter my sense of privacy and turn my life into a nightmare. I remember looking at the brown cardboard box on my desk, bewildered by the lack of return address or any identifying marking. It wasn't uncommon for me to receive packages. Working in product development, I often had prototypes or samples arrive at the office, but this was different. Something about it made me nervous. With a mixture of curiosity and apprehension, I opened the box carefully. The device inside it looked harmless. A plain black rectangle the size of a deck of cards with a small lens at one end. To the naked eye, it could have been a portable camera or some kind of sensor. But then I saw the handwritten note in hurried calligraphy on a crumpled piece of paper. "I know your secrets. Play if you dare." Heart started pounding. It had to be a joke, right? Some practical joke from a coworker. But as I was holding the device, a sense of unease ran down my spine. There was something deeply disturbing about it, a weight that seemed disproportionate to its size. With trembling fingers, I found the power button and pressed it. The device emitted a slight buzzing sound. A small screen lit up with static. For a moment it didn't appear, then the image cleared and I felt the blood drain from my face. It was me sitting at my desk in the same office, from an angle that seemed to come from the plant in the corner of the room. The date in the corner of the screen showed that the video had been recorded 3 days ago. I watched in horror as the version of me on the screen went about his daily activities, talked on the phone, wrote on the computer, ate at my desk, Everything seemed normal except for the fact that someone had been watching and recording me without my knowledge. The images continued to show me in different places in the office, in the meeting room, in the cafeteria, even in the hallway, near the bathroom. But the worst was yet to come. The next clip showed me at home cooking in the kitchen, watching TV, in the living room, even in my room preparing to sleep. My private life exposed on that small screen. I felt nauseous. How long had this been going on? How many cameras were there? And who was behind this? The device, and I stuck it back in the box as if it burned. I needed to think about finding a solution, but my mind was a whirlwind of panic and confusion. I spent the rest of the day in a state of paranoia, jumping with every sound, examining every object in my office with suspicion. There might be a hidden camera in my pen, in the smoke detector on the computer screen. When I got home that night, I searched for cameras in every corner of my apartment. I checked behind pictures, inside lamps, even in the vents. I found nothing, but that only scared me more. If I couldn't see them, meant they were expertly hidden. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in bed, with every fiber of my being alert, convinced that they were watching me. The next morning I went to the police, took the device with me, hoping they could trace its origin. But the officers didn't seem as alarmed as I expected. Some explicit threat, he asked. The officer who took my statement didn't. But this is a total invasion of my privacy. The policeman sighed. I understand, but without a direct threat or a suspect, we can't do much. We can keep the device and see if we found anything. But I didn't promise you anything. I left the station feeling lonelier than ever. In the days that followed, my paranoia intensified. I installed security cameras in my apartment, put extra locks on the doors. I even hired a private company to do a sweep of microphones and hidden cameras. They found nothing, but the videos kept coming in every week, a new package, each with a USB full of recordings, not only of me but of the people close to me. My mother at home, my sister in her college dorm, my best friend at work. They weren't just watching me, they were watching everyone I loved. It was then that something inside me changed. Fear, anger. I would no longer hide. I would dedicate myself to finding the person responsible. I spent weeks going through the recordings, looking for any clues, a reflection in a window, a shadow in the background, something, anything. With the help of a friend, a digital security expert, we traced the metadata of one of the videos to a location, an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. My heart pounding in my throat when I wasn't sure what I expected to find. A lunatic lonely with a wall full of screens, a secret surveillance organization. What I found was worse. The warehouse was empty except for a table in the center of the room. On it a single object, another package with my name handwritten. With my stomach churning, I opened it. Inside, there was a mirror and a note. It's always been you. And I stared at my reflection. My mind blanked then, as if a door in my memory opened. I remembered the project in the one who had worked years ago on an experiment on perception of reality, manipulation of memory, something that I myself had helped to develop but had never been just an experiment. It had worked, and now I was caught in its game, my own past rewritten, my present monitored, and my future uncertain. I left the warehouse knowing one thing for sure. I wouldn't stop until I found the version of me that had done this, and finishing what I had started. The day I found my journal entries rewritten was the day I began to question my own sanity. It wasn't just a few words changed here and there. Entire events had been altered, memories rewritten in my own handwriting. As I delved deeper into the mystery, I realized that the person I thought I was might be nothing more than elaborate fiction. I've always been faithful to my diary. Every night before going to sleep, I wrote down the events of the day, my thoughts, my fears, my hopes. It was a habit that I had maintained since childhood, a way of processing my life and keeping my memories intact. My collection of diaries went back years, each one a small chest of time with a different version of myself. That fateful morning I was looking for an old recipe that I remembered writing. I took out an diary from 2 years ago, and I started flipping through it, enjoying the trip to the past. It was then that I saw an entry about a party I had attended, but the details were completely wrong in my memory, and in my original entry it had been a disaster. I spilled wine on my new dress, I said the wrong thing in front of my crush, and left early embarrassed. But in this version the night had been a triumph, according to this story. To all of them with my wit I danced until dawn, and even shared a kiss with the same person before whom in reality I had humiliated myself. I stared at the page, my heart racing. The lyrics were unmistakably mine, with the same little ornament that I always put on my eyes. But the content was as if someone had taken my memories and twisted them into a more pleasant version. Melted and more than a little scared, I began to review more newspapers with each page I turned. My concern grew. Many entries had changed. Little things had changed at the beginning. A bad note turned into a good one. An argument with a friend transformed into a deep and meaningful talk. But as I moved on to more recent journals, the changes were more significant. The weekend I remembered spent crying over a breakup. Now it was full of adventures with friends. The job that had rejected me, according to this new version, I had rejected it for a better offer. Even my relationships were different. People from whom I had distanced myself, now they were described as close friends. I felt that I was going crazy. How could this be happening? I had blocked the true memories and had invented these less flattering versions, or someone was manipulating me on a large scale, imitating my handwriting perfectly. I needed answers. I began to compare my journal entries with other records, photos, emails, text messages. What I found only deepened the mystery. In some cases, the new entries matched the evidence I had. There were photos of me at events I didn't remember attending, text messages making plans I had no memory of. But in other cases, my original memories were backed up by hard evidence. The rejection mail from that work, I was still in my inbox, contradicting the diary entry that said that I had been the one who had rejected them. It was as if two versions of my life overlapped, real or completely false. I couldn't keep the university from you, and if anyone could help me make sense of this, it was him. I invited him home, spread my diaries on the coffee table, and explained what I had found. As I showed her the altered entries, I saw a series of emotions cross her face: confusion, concern, and then recognition. Sarah slowly said, "These new entries. That's how I remember things happening. I felt like the ground was opening up under my feet." "What do you mean?" I asked in a whisper. Alex looked awkward. "The party you mentioned looked uncomfortable. I remember that you were the life of the party. You were amazing that night. Everyone, they were talking about how funny and lovely you were." I shook my head, unable to process what I was hearing. "But that's not what happened," I insisted. "I made a fool of myself. I left early." Alex frowned. "Sarah, you may be misremembering that these new entries are the truth." I wanted to argue, insist that I knew my own life, but a seed of doubt was planted in my mind. If the memories of Alex matched these new entries, what did that mean? It was me who had everything wrong. The next few weeks became a spiral of obsession. I contacted other friends, family, even old acquaintances, asking them about specific events. The results were mixed. Some confirmed my original memories. Others matched the new versions of my diary. It was as if I was living in two parallel timelines, both equally real and unreal. I sought help. My therapist, Dr. Kaufman, listened patiently as I told her my story, showing her my journals and explaining the discrepancies. "Memory is a complicated thing," she said. "I came to the conclusion that our brains do not record events like a video camera. Rather, we create memories each time we recall them, and they may be influenced by our feelings, the situation we are in at the time, or even just the memory itself. However, this goes beyond recollections. Confusing, I argued, are complete rewrites of my life, and some are backed by evidence." The doctor nodded thoughtfully. "There is a phenomenon called confabulation. Explained is when people create false memories to fill gaps in their memory and can believing them completely. In some cases, people can construct whole stories about their lives that never occurred. The idea that I could have made up whole parts of my story was terrifying. But I also didn't explain the physical evidence that supported both versions of events. As the months went by, I began to accept that my life was in a state of uncertainty. I began to write my journal entries differently, recognizing both versions of events. Today, I either stayed home reading a book or I went for a walk with friends. Both feel equally real, and I'm no longer sure which one happened. It really was frustrating, but also somehow liberating. Then the day came that changed everything. As I flipped through my most recent journal, I noticed something strange, an entry with the date of tomorrow. I froze. How was it possible? With hands trembling, I read the page described. A normal day, I work, lunch with a friend, one night watching a new series, nothing extraordinary, but indisputably a glimpse into the future. The next day I decided to do exactly what I was screaming. Everything coincided. My friend, without me contacting him, invited me to lunch that night. The series mentioned in the entry premiered, and I ended up watching it. Since then I began to notice more future entries. Some were exact, others if I made different choices. My journals weren't just recording my life, they were shaping it. Now every night when I take my journal and I write, I stop. I'm recording my day, or I'm writing my future. I'm remembering my past, or I'm rewriting. Maybe deep down we all do. After all, we're the authors of our own story. even if we don't always realize the power of our own stories. I nearly threw the postcard away with the rest of the mail when it arrived on a Tuesday because it didn't seem like anything special. Just a generic picture of some mountains that I didn't recognize at first. However, something made me turn it over, and in tiny, precise handwriting, I read a message that made me shiver. It said, "I hope you enjoyed your morning run. The red shoes, they fit you well." My stomach churned that morning, and I had gone out running in my favorite red sneakers, but no one knew. The postcard had no return address, and the postmark was from a city 3 states away. It was dated nearly a week ago, so how could anyone have known what I would be doing today? I shook my head, trying to think. Perhaps it was a coincidence. Perhaps I had a secret admirer who left the postcard in a drawer, and I tried to forget it until the second one arrived. This one showed an image of a small coffee. I didn't recognize it, but when I read the message on the back, I felt a chill run down my spine. "Your presentation went well today. The blue really is your color." That same day I had given an important presentation at work, and yes, I had worn my favorite blue shirt for the occasion. It couldn't be a coincidence. I started to obsess over postcards. Every week a new one arrived. Always from a different place, always with a message that alluded to something I had done recently. "The haircut looked good on you. That argument with your sister was difficult, right? Watch out for your ankle. Maybe you should skip tomorrow's race." I felt observed not only on the street, but in my own house, in my room. I closed curtains. I checked each corner in search of hidden cameras. I even took my computer and my phone to check for tracks. Nothing. I wanted to ignore them, but the postcards kept coming. I tried to change my routine, do things spontaneously to surprise my invisible stalker, but the next week another postcard. Good try with the detour, but the park, it's beautiful this time of year, don't you think? Fear turned to paranoia. I started noticing every shadow, every face unknown in the crowd. Was the barista at the coffee shop, the upstairs neighbor, someone at my job? I went to the police, but they couldn't do anything. No threats, they said. Change your address. Maybe stop. He didn't. When I hired a private investigator, at first he looked at me like I was crazy. But when the postcards kept coming, predicting events before they happened, even he got nervous. It doesn't make sense," he said one night, looking at the postcards spread out on the table. "It's as if they were watching you." But from the future the idea left me cold. We decided to try something before going to sleep. I wrote a random sentence on a piece of paper. "Tomorrow I'll wear a yellow hat." I never wore hats, let alone yellow hats. The next morning I took a completely different route to work. I bought a yellow hat at a store on the way, and I used it. I spent the whole day wearing it. The postcard came the next week. What an interesting decision the yellow hat was. It suits you even if it's not your style. It dropped from my grasp. They weren't watching me anymore. They knew what I was going to do before I did it. The nights, they became unbearable. I stopped sleeping. I left, leaving work. All I did was wait for the next postcard, terrified of what it might contain. Then on a gray Wednesday something different came along. Not a postcard, a white envelope with my name written in the same impeccable handwriting. It took me hours to muster the courage to open it. Inside, a key and a note. "It's time for you to know the truth. Ticket office 103, Central Station, midnight." I knew it was crazy, that any reasonable person would have burned the key and pretended it never existed. But I needed answers at 11:45 at night. I arrived at the station. It was late, almost deserted. Only a few people were waiting for their night trains. I approached ticket office 103 with the key burning in my hand, trembling. I inserted it into the lock and turned inside. There was a small notebook of worn leather. I opened it with sweaty hands. It was my diary, but not the one I had written. The first pages were memories that I recognized, written in my handwriting. But as I went along, I found events that hadn't happened yet, plans I hadn't made, decisions yet, that I hadn't made yet. The last pages were dated 5 years in the future, and they talked about me, about how I would discover the truth about time, about how I had found a way to send me messages to the past, about how I was trying to warn me of what was to come, my own handwriting, my own journal, my own future. I dropped the notebook feeling dizzy. A sound on the platform made me turn to the other side of the station. In the dim light, I saw a figure watching me. My future self was a few years older, my face scarred by time, and he looked at me with a mixture of regret and determination. He took a step towards me, but before I could say anything, he turned and vanished into the shadows. I remained there with the key in my hand and the notebook open to a page that said, "Don't follow this path, don't make the same mistakes as me." Since that night, the postcards have stopped coming in, but the knowledge has stayed with me, and whenever I find myself at a turning point in my life, I ask myself if I'm making my own decisions or if I'm just living out a script I wrote myself.